thank you everybody for coming and joining us this evening. So we've looked at a range of different post-war landscape types which have been added to the Historic England Register in 2020. We've done new town parks, commercial landscapes, landscapes to public housing, public and semi-public parks and gardens. And in this mini section, we're looking at landscapes to private estates. And there are just two that made the grade in 2020, a high density development off the Edgware Road in London, and tonight's example from Span's Stable. So our objectives with these talks is to raise awareness about the work, the ideas and the thinking of the original designers, and also how these sites are now looking, to see what we can learn from this and take forward, to find out more about where the relevant archives are and what makes these places still so very special. So this week, we're really pleased to have Jan Woudstra, landscape architect and historian who's taught in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Sheffield since 1995. It's 27 years.
Oops.
His PhD at UCL explored the modernist landscape design and theory in 5 different countries and concentrated particularly on the landscape associated with the home. He's published widely, not just concentrating on landscape modernism, and is a member also of the FOLA committee. So over to you, Jan.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Yeah, we go straight in, I said. But, yeah, okay. Good. I'm just making a little amendment. I don't know whether you're all seeing these. Oops. Yeah. Okay. One moment. Just no, sorry. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to talk about Fieldend today and providing some international context. And this international context was really provided by 2 things. First of all, it is sort of the post-war generation of what are we going to do, and then how are we going to house the masses of people. One of these things was picked up very much early on by Colin Buchanan, which was the rise of the motor car and the way that the urban fabric was changing as a result of this, and the way in which there were extensive new developments outside towns. The interesting question of the from the 1950s to 1970s is how to deal with that motor car, how to deal with the car. The question indeed was, how do we want to live? I'm just going to, I don't know whether you see this as well. Annabelle, could you just respond whether you see your own name there in the top, or whether that is just me?
I can't see my name in the top.
Okay, oh good. Okay, then I'll just continue. Good. So the first time that was taken as a guide for design, the motor car was used as a guide for the design of a housing environment, was at Redburn, and it has since been referred to as the Redburn principle. It was housing development in the problematic years of the 1920s, the late 1920s, with a Great Recession, when a number of new towns were being planned, and Redburn was supposed to be a model financed by Ford. And this meant the creation of so-called a road system that was referred to as motorways, with access provided to small units of houses in cul-de-sacs, whereas the back of the house was connected with a pedestrian system that linked into the parks. In itself, this is not new. I mean, it had been done as from the 1840s onwards in London, but in this case, it was innovative because it was calculated to have car access, which provided sort of separation of the system between cars and pedestrians, and provided a safe way of children to walk to school and to the swimming pool and to the playing fields. So after the war, that model was explored in all kinds of different fashions, and I've just picked one example here, an influential book from the early 1960s that showed all kinds of examples from around the world and had one page to summarize it. And interestingly, the second one on the right-hand side here provides an example of Eric Lyons in London. Yeah, very schematic, but these were all sort of exploring the way of how to, or an alternative way of dealing with cars in a living environment. And this became something that you can find in the literature around Europe. I've just got one more example, i.e. From a Dutch book. We live, do we live, was the question of the book. And it was very much in the same trend as the first page that I showed you. Is how are we going to live in this new world? Here a number of models, Dutch models, are being explored for efficiency and ways of organizing and providing a living environment for the people. Very much an emphasis of having the car out of the environment, taking it out and creating an environment for people. Also retaining a density that would retain sort of an urban nature. Oops. I'm going to show you one example of this in the Netherlands. This is in the far east of the Netherlands, where a new town was being planned. Like England, post-war, there were new towns. And I've taken this one because in character, it is so similar to what was produced by the Span group of people. But it comes from a different set of criteria. It is different in a way. Here was an environment where a new town was being planned in order to house the people who were going to move into cities and had been agricultural workers. This was a village at that moment, and housing developments were planned all the way around this, and by two architects. This is the neighborhood I'm going to talk about, Angelslo in Emmen. Here on the right-hand side, you can see that new development here, this one. But it is one of many developments around the city, which were all sort of planned and built from the mid-1950s, from 1955 to the early 1970s, actually. Yeah, and these were being planned very much with consideration for the existing landscapes. This town or this village was situated on sort of a high sand ridge, high being 2.5 meters above sea level. But and then there were so-called essen. And essen are sort of the agricultural areas for the various villages which used to be there, which is where the sort of arable agriculture would have been sort of done. And these the concept initially was to save all these essen, these higher lying agricultural areas, and as a feature, as a characteristic feature of that landscape, and build around the existing woodland as well. Oops. That is, I'm just going back and see whether I can do that. So we've got here the situation before, and here's the situation afterwards. This is the area which I'm going to talk about, which was first produced in a schematic area. Very much at the time was the notion of having to create new centers, and each neighborhood, and that was very much had come in during the Second World War, the notion of the neighborhood, an optimum unit of about 30 to 60,000 people, which would be independent, which would have its own center, which you see here marked in red, and then the neighborhoods that would relate to that, and where people would do all their shopping in these sort of neighborhoods. So that all these neighborhoods would be independent, separate units around an old center with preserved woodlands. Oh, something is not going quite right here. But so this was a schematic drawing, and it was done by two young then architects who had just qualified from studying what is called in the Netherlands city building, town planning, as they call it here, and Nick de Boer and André de Jong. And they're both sort of planners and architects and landscape architects, qualified for all. And this was the ultimate design. The area here on the right-hand side was not initially intended. So these were the neighborhoods that were supposed to be linked to the city center. And what you see here is these units, and you very much see this Redburn principle being applied. But here the roads did not stop. They weren't in cul-de-sacs, and because the pedestrian networks basically continued from here as well. So so these became, and here you see this area situated as it lay within all the other new neighborhoods being planned there at the time. All of these were done by Nick de Boer and André de Jong. Nick de Boer later became a professor in urban design at Delft University and was very influential in sort of town planning, and particularly in urban design for people. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So this was the sort of one of the books which Nick de Boer wrote as an academic, a review where he went back over his designs in 1986 and reassessed some of his own designs amongst those of others. What you see here is sort of a design where it becomes clear that you've got these areas in front of houses with communal gardens, which were accessible to the general public, but they were secondary in that instance. So we've got here, and cars being kept to the side here on the side. Cars were sort of given a secondary position. The city center contained some high-rise blocks, which were there to make it urban, and that was one of the purposes of it, to create a real sort of urban core, as it was referred to, and with very wide roads. But the neighborhoods were all sort of planned around the existing landscape features. Existing trees were carefully preserved, and the new neighborhoods planted with vegetation that created separation between the different sections of the neighborhood. So this is what they referred to at the time as articulation of the neighborhood itself, so that you don't have one big neighborhood, but everyone feels an identity by the areas created by these groups of planting and by rows of trees. These are some of my own slides of black and white photographs, and I had to scan them from the black and white photographs because I couldn't find the negatives. But here we've got sort of the the type of housing which, with its flat roofs and systematic building types, is very similar in looks, in general looks, as what I found in the Span estates, but set up in a much larger sense. And of course, it is social housing. And here you see one of these Essen, these agricultural areas, being used to exemplify that height difference within the area, and to utilize that, and also retaining some of the existing firs there, creating an instant landscape that was much appreciated, and became a model for housing development right around the Netherlands. And here again, you see another example with sort of communal areas. With that, I need to say that some 78% of housing in the Netherlands until 1990 was social housing. So having a private housing scheme was not very common. And here again, sort of a playground incorporated, very much modeled on what Aldo van Eyck was doing in Amsterdam, who was the other influential person with respect to sort of living environments and children's play. Here you see the sort of the front gardens, which are also maintained communally, so as to create this sense of general sense of character. But of course, you know, we haven't got the grade levels to play with, which we will find in a minute at Fieldend, for example. Here again, the Hunbed, which is an ancient burial monument, which became a feature within the area. And Nick de Boer became famous for not just Emmen, but also for his theories. He wrote a lot, but he also was able to critically assess other schemes. And one of those which he used as an example in his book was a book by Walter Schwagenscheid, A Human Wanders the City. Or Man Wanders the City. It was translated in 3 languages, but in Germany first. And that drawing on the right-hand side is of sort of the new neighborhoods that were being built, not just in the Netherlands, but also in Germany, in France, where basically the cars got lost and you came into environments that were dead end, and were referred to as cauliflower neighborhoods. He coined the term in the early 1990s, and this has remained ever since. It wasn't something he invented or promoted, and in fact he criticized it because he always wanted to have an access through. You needed to be able to go through and to be en route to create a real urban environment, which he promoted. Well, his principles were also adopted and employed in the notion of the woonerf. And the woonerf is something that is well known in this country. We've got them as what do we call them here? Home zones is one of the terms applied for them, but woonerf is also up in the English dictionary now. And that incorporated creating streets into living environments where cars had the same rights as pedestrians. So you had the sign at the front, so it was clearly identifiable. There were vegetation was much used as a barrier for it to become a through route. The pavement was shared, so everyone, cycles, pedestrians, and cars all have the same rights. And the generally was sort of associated furniture that encouraged people to make use of the street as a living environment. So this woonerf is a notion that was initially developed in Emmen. So, and we see these examples right across the Netherlands. And nowadays, Google says 20% of the Dutch people live in environments that have been sort of modified or created to become woonerfs. Well, this notion must also have played in New Ash Green, which was proposed by Span in the 1960s, because we can recognize the model here. It's very much of its time. The center, the proposed center, right in the middle. At the time, there was much a question of having a park next to the center, and that became a feature of the various new towns at that time. It was something that had been discussed at the conference at Hoddesdon, the so-called the core, and was applied here at New Ash Green. But what you see here again is these creation of these different neighborhoods, which are independent but then related to this central area, within that whole. And the various drawings exemplify this, and and with different configurations of these of the housing, but then cutting it up in manageable portions here on the right hand side, envisaged. Unfortunately, this didn't quite happen, but it was a notable attempt, and one of the clear examples that you've got in this country. The center created with the planting by Preben Jakobsen, with planting plans, which were very much looked at the use of trees. And when I visited it in 1989, it looked in a pristine condition. I haven't been since, but that was also my problem to Emmen. I haven't been since. And cannot speak of the latest sort of developments. Another interesting example of that is, of course, the sort of the various infill developments starting at Ham Common. So Span was the housing that was created for the new middle class after the war. There was a housing available for the rich, and there was housing, social housing available for the mass, but the new middle classes weren't being catered for. So that is something that was done by Eric Lyons and his partners, and Barclays was one of the first ones which adopted an existing nursery with the plants being used here to create an immediate housing environment, as one of the first. Within that, there was also experimentation going on. The experimentation here was with respect to the front of the house, and the emphasis was on creating a setting for communal life. And what you see here is the project for St. Nicholas Street in Coventry, which shows that with some planting in front of the houses that was communally maintained and was going to be maintained as part of the whole, whereas the emphasis is on the central area where communal life would take place with sufficient articulation of trees to provide a clear distinction and to divide cross views and provide shelter as well, and coziness. Coziness is I think is a good word here. So this housing was kept cheap by having set models, and there are a whole set of models which were sort of repeated over and across the different developments, and you can find them in the various housing developments of span at Blackheath and elsewhere, particularly in the southeast of the country. And to that also belonged standard landscape features. So things didn't have to be reinvented for every scheme, but this drawing could be run out, and these features could be sort of set up. Yeah, this is an important sort of move towards standardization in order to keep it affordable. Well, the development at Fieldend covered sort of the area which I've tried to highlight with a yellow marker pen here. A former nursery which had been sort of bombed out partially and used as a dumping ground, and that became the site for an infill development, as many of the others. So the question, there's always a compromise in that instance. The interesting thing about the drawings in which they were produced is that, in fact, the north is at the bottom, but it's drawn from the way in which you enter the development. So here you see it from the north towards the south, which is in fact, the way. This is easier to explain. You come in an area where you can park, and then there is one of the remarkable things here is this road which goes all the way around the development in order to access the parking facilities, the garages, but becomes something which I'll come back to in a minute. But that is what has been sort of criticized in current town planning theory of responsive environments as creating insecure backs, because this cannot be controlled, because the control is on the central areas in the center, and that is what is what these developments were noted for, and that is what's great about them. In addition to the planting, which was consistent. Michael Brown has usually been credited for the planting and for the scheme, but Ivor Cunningham's initials are the first on the planting plan, and in our office it was the convention that the person who produced the drawings put his initials first and the person who had contributed the second. So with this I leave open for discussion. Here you see this development from the sky during a winter's day, with all the trees sort of quite faint, but here you see sort of the road all the way around, and coming back to the center, and here the planting plants, Ivor Cunningham and Michael Brown. The interesting thing is that the planting plants also contain the setting out plan for the mushroom lights, which you see here on the right. And here again, sort of great detail, which consists of a whole series of plane trees, which James Strike will sort of talk about in a minute. But these are very important in order to structure the whole area, to separate it and create a definite environment. And yeah, that all helps. So thank you very much, Colin, for taking these photographs. I was here for the first time in 1983. I was there again at the celebration in about 1985 when I fell into a party here. So I've been able to follow it, and it still looks as good as I remember it. Yeah, with the cars forcing people to walk to their residences, with consistent planting of the front, which is sort of communally arranged. In here we've got yeah, a good example. Of course, there are problems, and I'll come back to those in a minute. And then you go in further, get out of your car, and you walk into the area which is the communal area alongside your planting. And then you come into this central area, this central space, which is scooped out. It is sculpted towards the houses, which are slightly higher, giving them a little bit of sort of security and an ability to overview the center. That's beautifully done and beautifully sculpted. The only comment which I will make is with respect to the maintenance of the planting, and that is what occurs in a lot of these span developments now. As planting has matured, how do you maintain the vegetation? And yeah, unfortunately, a lot of things get sculpted into big sculptural forms, whereas the intention was to have it much more informal and loose, and that goes with a more sort of considered pruning regime than the one that is generally given to these sites. Yeah, great for play. It's for people to sit, and you can see that use. You can feel it when you come there. It feels homely. It feels cozy, and it works. And yeah, here's the sort of the typical effect which Ivor Cunningham would have screamed about, and Preben Jakobsen even more so. But it does provide with a very sort of pleasant and green environment. Most public housing environments have edited out the shrubbery planting. It is always an issue. How do you maintain it, and how do you keep it affordable? But yeah, this is one of these instances where this could be done. Here again, sort of the relationship. You can see how the houses are slightly higher, sort of 60 centimeters higher than the center, and that just sets it off enough, gives you privacy within, and it gives you a view out, and you don't feel contained within your house. So yeah, these walks through the screens of trees to the next section, and it is just it helps you to provide the separation, and it is beautiful articulation of those spaces. But of course, you know, trees grow, and large trees can cause problems, and there needs to be renewal of some trees, you know, this particular smaller species. And how do you do that? So there's this balance to be achieved that needs to be considered and yeah, applied. The children's playground here rather to the side, not as beautifully integrated as I showed you in Emmen, but that is yeah, a consideration, probably something that has been done afterwards. And here sort of the backs, what are they, and how do you access them? What is the relationship of the backs and the fronts? How do you access them? How do you create secure backs, which is what responsive environments, the main sort of design theory for housing developments today, sort of applies. And yeah, here you see some prickly plants being planted in order to sort of prevent entry, perhaps, and that is, yeah, something that was not considered at the time of when it was laid out. And here the garages, keeping the car well out of the front, but you know, the whole emphasis and additional play here to the side, but the whole emphasis being on that central area and on sort of the encouragement of social life within that. And also the notion of the various details. All these details, the hexagonal paving is something that was first done by Professor Sørensen, Carl Theodor Sørensen in Denmark. It became famous in photographs in the architectural press and in the landscape architectural press, and it was something that was applied here at the Span development. These tiles in themselves are great and unique, as are these concrete tiles. These are the things that nowadays tend to disappear quite quickly in housing development, either tarmacked over or replaced with block paving. So it's good to have them still here. And here we depart outside the area, back to the car and out, and see here the use of the trees to provide a screen and a roof to the cars, and keep them separate, and then out back to the main road. So we've been around the development in different ways, and that is what is so unique here. You can walk through it, you can walk around it. There is consideration of how the car has been employed, and in an instance where you've got control through a gardens committee, which is what is being done here, you can control what happens to that vegetation, at least to a certain extent, and and maintain it accordingly. Well, in 2006, Barbara Sims edited a great book on Eric Lyons and Span, which gives a great deal of additional background. It reflects on the various uses of landscape within it, on the buildings and the architecture itself, and on some of the detailing. So I would well recommend that for those uninitiated or those wanting to know more as a reading matter. In addition, James Strike, who is going to talk next, has written an interesting little book from the perspective of Fieldend, the spirit of Span housing, and I'm going to carry the baton over to him. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to introduce James next. Maybe could you? Oh yes, no, that's Bill. So James Strike is a retired architect, having worked in private practice and also at English Heritage. So he's lived with his wife at Fieldend for 20 years. So I think that makes him just the most valuable person to listen to now. So James has written several books, including Architecture and Conservation, Managing Development at Historic Sites, and the book that Jan has just showed us, The Spirit of Span Housing. So James, over to you.
James, you haven't got your microphone.
Oh, sorry.
How's that?
Yeah. Better, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Fine. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for asking me to speak. Firstly, may I just say that both of those books, the Barbara's books and mine, are available on Amazon books if you wish to get a copy. The Spirit of Span Housing, I think, is available on Amazon also as an electrical, as a digital thing. Right. I think it's important just to say a few words about how Fieldend works. There are 51 houses, and when you buy the freehold of the house, you also become a 51st owner of the Fieldend company. And with this commitment to the freehold, you have a commitment to the covenant of the Fieldend Company. This covenant is very important. It means that the company takes on a responsibility and you take on a responsibility. The responsibility that the company takes on is for the repainting of the houses every 4 years, which obviously has a great advantage in ensuring that all the houses remain looking the same, cleaning the windows, lighting around the estate, and maintaining the community gardens, for which I'll speak later. And equally important, the residents as freeholders accepting the covenant commit themselves to making no alterations to the front of the houses, and lots of other sort of minor things like not leaving the dustbins out and those sort of things, which all help enormously in the way that we're able to sort of control the well-being and keeping the place sort of tidy and intact. I also need to say that the company, Fieldend Company, is actually managed by the directors, and the directors are elected from the residents themselves. So we have no expensive management agent to worry about. And the directors change hands gradually over a period of time, but they are resident, they are approachable, and through the natural processes of meetings and annual general meetings, we were able to sort of communicate with them and let everybody's views known. So let's have a look at the advantages of living at Fieldend. As you've seen from the presentation by Jan, the houses informally enclose the landscape, and the houses themselves overlook the landscape. So as a resident, it really does mean that children can play safely. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when young children come back from school, you see them running around on their own, cycling around in their little bicycles and tottering around with their own toys. And you know perfectly well that quite a number of parents are just sort of keeping an eye through the window, watching what's going on. It all works exceptionally well. And then we have lots of community activities for residents to enjoy Fieldend. We have children's games, summer evening jazz concerts, croquet tournaments. I've noticed that in one of Jan's photographs, you could actually just see the remnants of where the croquet lawn was. It's remarkable how the grass grows back, and after a few weeks, certainly about a month, you wouldn't have known it was there. We have weddings and marquee tents and meetings for the estate tidying up, where we do a bit of our own gardening. We also employ, obviously, regular gardeners to do the majority of the work, who incidentally have been with us, I think, father and son, ever since it started in the 60s. It's still the same family. And we meet for these, they call them estate tidings. It's really sort of a time to sort of meet and have a cup of coffee. But we do a certain amount of tidying up. And what is so nice is that we do planting bulbs and shrubs and snowdrops and primrose daffodils and cowslips around the estate. And recently we've just been given a wonderful collection of mixed species of hedges from the Woodland Trust, which we've been busy particularly planting around the edge of the estate. Yes, Jan is quite right. The road round the back does present a problem. We've had break-ins and this, that, and the other of people climbing over into our estate. And you know, with extra hedging, planting, we able to reduce this sort of thing. So it's a lovely place to live and enjoy, and we all get to know each other incidentally. There's sort of unwritten rules. You don't stare into people's front living rooms when you walk past, but nevertheless, there's always lots of opportunities to meet and enjoy things. So here we are, we have 51 houses. It's inevitable that there's going to be various opinions as to what Fieldend should be. Let's consider the landscape. I mean, I think some people would like it in a wilder forest. Other people like it as parkland. I'm sure there's a few people who would like to see it trimmed back much more like a sort of municipal park. And I think there's some kids who would like to see it much more like a permanent football pitch. But there we are. We all have our own aspirations for it. And I think it's absolutely marvelous. And again, I think it's because the directors are actually residents that we managed to muddle our way through and reach some form of compromise. But the landscape does present certain problems. Trees, yes. The scheme by Michael Brown had these rows of plane trees marked out, very useful in as Jan says, sorting out differentiations between particular spaces. But particularly in one of the two large enclosed spaces, they were planted out quite close together, formally round the edge, rather like a London square. And these plane trees have, over 60 years, have grown enormously now. And for better or worse, quite a number of them were blown down in the gales, but we still have some, and they're absolutely enormous. And you know, the cost of pruning them, I mean, yet alone getting permission through tree preservation orders. The trouble, of course, is that with Richmond Council, the same with many local authorities, you know, every year when you go back to review the situation and review the trees, you find yourself confronted with a different tree preservation officer. So you have to start from the beginning again. It all takes time. Lots of residents have different views about how much their garden or their house is overshadowed by the trees. It's obviously a constant changing thing, but we constantly review it and manage to look after it. We also actually, incidentally, it's had moth fungus at, about a year ago in one of the, I don't know the technical names for these things, but it costs a lot of money with high spray equipment. And of course, the cost of pruning the plane trees is enormous and has to be met out of our monthly contribution to the company. Another problem is that the landscape that comes right up to the front door. We don't have front gardens. We have a small back garden, which is very nice, and do as you wish in it. But the parkland, the communal area, comes right up to the front doors, which from a parkland point of view is absolutely marvelous and gives a wonderful sense of landscape to the enclosed areas. Then on the other hand, the residents, and including myself, you know, there's a natural tendency to want to give your own identity to the area just outside your front door. And, you know, we have from time, we don't have people putting up little fences, you know, it doesn't go as far as that, but we do have sort of people wanting to put out Victorian chimney pots or put a pretty little sort of flower bed in front of them, which is not, again, not within the spirit of the park land that that we're aiming for. There was quite a conflict between Michael Brown, who wanted quite formal London spaces with his plane trees, and Eric Lyons and Ivor Cunningham, who saw it very much more as an informal serendipity of growth. Now then, excuse me. The question also arises, should there be more colour in the landscape? Over the years, when it started, there was a real strong control that everything had to be green and parkland. We've always had snowdrops, which have been absolutely beautiful, but now we're actually sort of beginning to plant out with daffodils and cowslips and other things, and maybe introducing one or two more interesting shrubs. Jan is quite right that the shrubs have overgrown. When I came here about 10 years ago, there was the gardener had a sort of great fetish for cutting everything into square shapes, and we had to say, you know, let's try and get these more natural shapes. And recently, again, we've thinned out a lot and cut back, and you know, it's general management and keeping it always lively and realistic. Ever mindful of the environment, we've reintroduced areas of long meadow grass, which are seasonal and look beautiful at certain times of year. In this residential setting, it's quite difficult, and there is a sort of danger that this meadow grass may look like unkept gardening, that there's a sense of sort of neglect about it. And I think we've found that in these residential settings, this long meadow grass really has to have very sharp edges, cut quite neatly around the edges, and maybe with little sort of serpentine cut paths through it, so that it looks very purposeful and rather than something which is, as I say, some form of neglect. And another sort of quirky little thing that's happened is that during COVID, we purchased some extra benches, which were wonderful summer evenings, and people would set them apart for safety, but take a glass of wine and have a chat with people. And it worked very well at keeping the community going during the COVID problems. The problem now, I think I'm speaking rather personally, because this is something that I sort of feel about, is that there is a danger that with so many benches, we might start looking like an old people's home or even a sort of church memorial garden. But there we are, that's something which we need to watch. And of course, car parking. We're very fortunate that all the car parking is round the back in the service road, so it doesn't impinge problems in the landscaped areas. But residents, I'm quite fortunate because I live at the sort of far end of the estate, but those people living nearer the entrance to it have a more difficult time. We have CPZ parking in the streets around here. We have students from St. Mary's University We have quite a large school just at our doorstep. I personally don't mind parents parking in Fieldend to drop off or collect their children from school. But when it comes to, I don't know, students or staff parking their cars for a week or even a term around the back, we really have to do something about it. It's compounded, of course, by the fact that the garages were built in the 60s, and frankly, they're too small for people to park their modern cars in, and they're just used as storage space. Fortunately, we haven't got one, so that's okay. So there we are. These are the sort of problems. I know that the directors are very keen to keep some form of balance between rigid control and persuasion. We have a booklet, which I personally wrote a few years ago, called Looking After the Front of the House, which is a sort of a guideline for making quite sure that you don't spoil the detailing and the special editing of the roof trims and this, that, and the other. Maybe we need to write another booklet now, you know, looking after our common landscaped area. Something I shall give some thought to. Well, there we are. If you come to Fieldend, do come round to our house. You'll be very welcome. And I remember we had Open House London here some few years ago, and we had 100 visitors in one day. So there's obviously quite an interest. And long may it continue. I certainly enjoy living here enormously, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, and you, Jan. That was such a thorough, in-depth, interesting, stimulating presentation between the two of you. So many thanks indeed. We don't have a lot of time, but we do have some rather interesting questions. So if I may, we'll crack on with the questions. Jan, do you want to unmask and declare your reality? Hang on a minute, I'll just get the technology. Annabelle, I'll ask for you on this one, if I may, but when were bicycles planned for in the Emmon development? I'm fudging the issue of pronouncing the...
Yeah, you pronounce it very well, thank you. Yeah,
Emmon, I can do.
Yeah, the whole town was intended to be used for cycling, and it is not just this neighborhood, but it's the concept from 1955.
I think that's presumably bicycles have a very long history, as long as
they have, and the Dutch government has invested in bicycle provision since that period. So it's the post-war period. So that's why there is such a advantage over what's done here.
Thank you, Karen. Do you want to unmic and actually ask your question? You might get the pronunciation better than I do.
Hi, thank you. Lovely. James and Jan, thanks a million. That was so great. Really enjoyed it. And it was particularly nice getting a resident's perspective, James.
Thank you.
I will knock on the door next time I'm there.
Please.
Jan, I am just a couple of questions. I was just wondering, it was fascinating seeing the link with the Dutch development and the planning of that. And did you draw any parallels with stuff that Rasmussen was doing in Denmark in terms of planning? Is there any kind of overlay there?
Well, it was an international movement. And the discussion started in 1906 with the Berlin plan, and they were then and then there are a number of different schools formed, but that's the subject of a whole separate lecture, really. But that involves Miege and Schumacher in Germany, and then it traveled around the world, and it takes in the American world as well. So it is it's very difficult to assess who produced what first, and I find that every time that there are links, and the links were particularly through SIAM, the International Congress of Modern Architecture. So they had a tremendous influence. And particularly, I mentioned the Hoddesdon Siam conference, the core of the city, that was also a very important marker in development, as indeed was the sort of the pre-war Amsterdam conference, which led to the development of the Western Garden cities in Amsterdam, which are all where you can see all these principles being applied. So it is something that was about, it was within the CM, within a group of architects, but it was also within a group of landscape architects, and that was around Leberecht Miege, and they had a completely different vision, which, and then I'm afraid that the Germans were leading in that, but you see these developments then ongoing in Finland, in Sweden, in Sweden particularly. Sweden was the first one to pick it up, and then Denmark soon afterwards. So it's going all around, really.
Thank you. Helen, thanks, Jan. Helen, can I just ask my other question?
Yes, absolutely.
So James, having been involved in the listing of these sites a couple of years ago with the Gardens Trust and some other people in the audience, I'm just interested to know, having been added to the National Heritage List as a registered landscape, what's the impact been on the estate and the residents, if any?
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's a matter of considerable pride and joy. In terms of administration, I know that we've very recently had an annual general meeting, and we actually sort of raised this question about what the implications were, and it's something which they are going to address themselves in terms of producing some form of policy and way of dealing with the extra legislation. It's new to us, and as I say, the directors, it's high up on their list of issues to address. At the moment, it hasn't impacted in terms of any specific legislation or control within Fieldend. I want to stress again, we're always trying to find this sort of balance between, the less legislation and rules we have, the better, the more we can control by persuasion.
Yes, okay. If the management committee do need any, I don't know, guidance or conversations on it, I'm sure people in the Gardens Trust might be able to offer some information.
I think that is a brilliant suggestion. I mean, the directors are our residents. We don't have, we have some very capable people who have worked in the landscape world, but
the Gardens Trust as a sway,
not so much in terms of the academic world. And I think that's a lovely idea. I shall certainly, I'm not on the committee now. I'm not a director at present, but I will certainly pass that on. I think it's lovely.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Helen.
Okay, anything else you want to say, or shall I move on?
I think you should give other people a chance.
Yeah, okay. Virginia and Ernie, I love your comments about current bund pruning and cloud pruning, though it's obviously cumulus rather than stratus. Do you want to say anything about the paving, or just read Karen's comments in the blog? They're all very pertinent as always. Annabelle, do you want to pop in here about the span model freehold?
Yes, I just wondered if the model has been used elsewhere by other developments.
Yes, it has. I think Green, the one in Blackheath, Green, can't remember the name. Corner Green. Thank you. My wife is talking from in the distance. Corner Green, I'm pretty certain, and there are, yes, quite a number of them have. I think it's to do with numbers of houses. Span had quite a range of size developments from, 8 houses to New Ash Green. And it's the smaller ones which have suffered the most, because they haven't got sufficient mass to set up a working committee. When I first wrote Spirit of Span House, Sarah and I went round every Span development, and we certainly found that, as I say, the small ones particularly had disintegrated in terms of Span ethics.
Yes.
And some of the larger ones, like Parkleys, were doing it okay, but weren't so successful. We have 50 houses, which seems, from a community point of view and a management point of view, to be a really nice size for development and for this type of management.
That's very interesting. I would actually, my question was really whether outside of Span, whether the model's been adopted. No, I'm sorry. I'm not. It's not something that I've sort of studied or even really given much thought to. Because it seems such a clever model, isn't it? It's such a clever, sensible.
Well, I've always thought I ought to write to the Minister of Housing and tell him how wonderful it is, but I've never got around to doing that. But I mean, Span has been copied by quite a number of building developments, but I don't think the management process has been adopted. It works very well at Fieldend.
And so my other question, sorry, Helen, are Span houses full of architects?
Yes, we do have quite a lot of architects on board. It also goes through another cycle. When we came 10, 15 years ago, whenever it was a little bit geriatric, if I might use that word. And when I walked in, God, I have to be careful what I say. When I walked in, they said, "Oh my God, there's another oldie come." Fortunately, over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly these last 2 or 3 years, we've had an influx of young families, and it's so nice to see the kids all running around again. Although they do leave their bloody toys out.
Kids, eh?
Thank you.
Thanks, Annabelle. Well, on the subject of kids, quick question for me. And you mentioned areas for communal life. Did it work at the time? And I'll finish my question, then you two can answer it. Obviously, it's still working today, James, from the sound of it. But has the concept of communal life changed? And if it hasn't at Fieldend, is that due to the very special arrangements that you have? So Jan, do you want to start and then pass the baton to James?
Well, I can't really answer how it is being done. I think James is the person to answer that one. But it is being applied elsewhere, and particularly Denmark is famous. I mean, it's not called communal; it's called collective. But it's basically is communal. And I also see a lot of this in the Netherlands, and where street parties are held on an annual basis, and the community, the mass organizes it. So it is, the residents are very much in charge, and that's good to see, really. And it sort of changes the whole character of an environment when people take care and care for it.
Yeah.
I don't think the sense of community has changed, certainly in the fairly lengthy time I've been there, and talking to people who I've known who have lived here all the time. I would say that the degree of control has changed. It was much stricter control when we first came. I remember Sarah was planting some snowdrops in front of the tree outside our house, and the person in charge came marching over, what the hell do you think you're doing? You know, this sort of thing. But now it's much more relaxed. I think that's the only change I can really sort of identify.
Thank you. Thank you. John, forgive me if I voice your question for you because we're short on time, but John asks, do you know whether the other Span estates have all matured and been maintained as well as Fieldend?
I've seen various estates that have been well maintained. I haven't the last couple of years, so I can't really sort of vouch for that. So my knowledge is from the early 1980s, 1982 to 1995, when they were all similarly well maintained, and I've been back to a few places and advised, and found them in a pretty good state, really. So there are various places where the spirit continues, so to speak.
But they are looked after in different ways. I mean, there's some flats in Brighton where full of colours of shrubs and plants and trees and pergolas and sort of things like that. And there's Corner Green, which is really sort of trimmed remarkably well. And you think, God, children can't play here. I'm probably completely wrong, but you know, one does get the impression that they are looked after in different ways, but equally valued in their own right.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. And Karen also confirms that there's a high standard of maintenance. Just a moment, if you will. Colin, are you there? Do you want to read your question, or would you prefer if I did? I hope you're still there.
Yes, I'm still here.
Thank you. Would you just...
yeah, it's just an observation, really. I visited Fieldend in 1974 when I was actually working for Michael Brown. I had an overwhelming impression of a birch grove with a few houses around it. I visited a lot in the 1980s, but then didn't until 2017. And I was a bit disappointed because the impression had changed to a very well-treated estate, but the birches, there was only a few left and they were very over mature. And it's really about how you manage things like birch, which have a very short life and get quite ugly when they're old. We attempt to keep the sort of birch grove that was originally there.
I think we've just planted about 20 more silver birch trees.
Oh, good. You better go back then, Colin.
Well, I still think the place is fantastic.
They look a bit young at the moment.
So much so that I was the one that proposed it for listing to the Gardens Trust. So I must still love it.
Excellent. Well
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. You've got some very nice comments in the boxes. I do hope you can read the chat and have a look. And yes, Virginia ends up by saying these are the kind of questions that need to be addressed in a conservation management plan. I can't endorse that more fully. Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much, both of you. Annabelle, can I pass over to you now?
Yes, thank you. James and Jan, thank you so much for a fantastic evening. I think, Jan, you've given us a lovely journey, all the origins of this sort of development, which I think is extraordinary. And I'm really sorry that I didn't have that 20 or 30 years ago, or 40, or however old that I am. And I think, James, the insight that you've given us as well from a resident with a special eye, I think with a specially trained eye, I think has also been really useful. So fantastic. I'd like to thank you both for such a wonderful evening.